When I first met Eric's grandmother, June, I thought she was the picture of grace and loyalty. At 89, she was tiny but sharp, her blue eyes glinting with a liveliness that betrayed her age. She wore pearls to family dinners and spoke of Eric's grandfather with such reverence that I imagined she must have lived a life filled with love, stability, and devotion. She was, to everyone, the ideal of a wife and mother, the anchor of her family. Eric and I were at a crossroads in our own relationship when everything changed. We'd been engaged for just over a year, but our wedding plans were endlessly delayed. There was a tension between us, a silent question we were both afraid to ask. Is this really what we want? It was during one of those family gatherings, over tea and shortbread cookies in June's warm, quaint living room, that the first hint of her secret life slipped out. We had been laughing, swapping stories about how Eric and I met in college, our plans for the future, the one-day dreams we kept sharing with our families but had yet to act on. June listened, nodding with a knowing smile. Then out of nowhere she asked, "Do you think you'll be happy with only one person for the rest of your life?" Her words stopped me mid-laugh, and the room fell into a stunned silence. Eric and I exchanged a glance, both of us caught off guard. June chuckled softly, clearly aware of the effect her question had. "Love is a curious thing," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as if confessing a sin, though no one had asked her to. "Sometimes love doesn't obey the rules we set for it, and sometimes it doesn't even obey the heart." She took a long sip of tea, her eyes distant, as if she were looking at something or someone none of us could see. After the gathering ended, Eric and I couldn't stop talking about it. I was curious, but Eric seemed uncomfortable. "She's old," he said, brushing it off. "She probably didn't mean anything by it." But I could see the unease in his eyes. It was a glimpse into something he didn't want to confront, some fear that mirrored my own doubts. A few days later, I found myself standing outside June's door alone, the rest of the family conveniently busy. She greeted me with her usual warm smile, and we settled into the same chairs with the same tea, as if she had expected me. "June," I started cautiously, "what did you mean by what you said the other day? About love not always obeying the heart?" She watched me with that same spark, and then in a voice almost conspiratorial she said, "I don't know what the world would think of me if they knew, but my whole life, I've loved more than one man." My heart skipped. "You mean besides Grandpa?" June nodded, and there was no shame in her eyes, only a strange, quiet pride. "His name was Raymond. I met him when I was 23. I loved him in a way that was different, a fire that I kept hidden. We'd sneak letters, glances, the stolen afternoons when we could get away with it. He was a businessman, traveled a lot. No one suspected a thing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. June, the same June who lectured Eric and me on marriage vows, on the sanctity of commitment, had spent her life in the shadow of a secret lover. How could you do that?" I asked, unable to keep the accusation out of my voice. She didn't seem offended, only smiled softly. "I loved your grandfather dearly, but it wasn't the same. Raymond, he filled parts of me that my husband couldn't, parts one didn't even know were there until I met him. My world felt like it was shifting under my feet. Didn't you feel guilty? All those years?" June sighed, her gaze distant again. "Guilt? Perhaps. But regret? No, not once. I think sometimes we're so afraid of shattering the idea of ourselves that we deny our own desires. But in the end, our lives are too short to ignore what makes us feel alive." That night I told Eric everything. He was quiet, his face pale. "Do you think she's right?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to answer. June's confession had opened up a box inside me that I wasn't sure I wanted to peer into. I loved Eric, at least I thought I did. But there was something missing, something that June's story had teased into being, a question that had been dormant but was now very alive. What if I was meant to love more than one person too? Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling June had left me with. I found myself watching Eric differently, wondering if he too had some hidden yearning, something he was afraid to tell me. He in turn became more distant, as though he could sense that I was holding something back. Then one weekend on a whim we decided to go to the mountains, just the two of us. It was something we hadn't done in months. As we hiked through trails blanketed in autumn leaves, the conversation began slowly, but soon we were talking freely, sharing fears we'd kept locked away. I told him how I felt, the doubt June's words had awakened, the fear that I might not be cut out for the kind of love we had both imagined. And to my shock, he admitted he'd been feeling the same way. What started as a confession became a challenge, a dare. We spent the weekend as if we were strangers, free to rediscover each other but also free to explore ourselves, our limits, our boundaries. There was something electric between us now, a sense that we were no longer bound by the expectations that had been suffocating us. It was exhilarating and confusing. I couldn't help but wonder if June had ever intended for her words to lead me here, to this place of uncharted freedom and fear. When we returned from the mountains, we were different. We weren't the same naive couple who believed that love was a neat, tidy thing. We knew it could be messy, it could hurt, and it might even mean admitting that we were both capable of loving more than just each other. Months later, as we stood before June's grave after she quietly passed, Eric and I held hands tightly, both knowing that the person who had taught us to question love would always be a part of ours. We would honor her secret not by hiding, but by living openly, letting love be wild, unpredictable, and real. And in the end, we realized that perhaps June's greatest secret wasn't the affair itself, but the courage it gave her to live authentically, even in a world that would never understand. After June's passing, Eric and I couldn't quite return to our old lives. Her secret had taken root in us, growing like a seed planted deep, demanding to be tended. The revelation of her long-standing affair had set off a series of questions, whispers between us that we couldn't ignore. Could we ever go back to being just us, knowing that people like June, people we loved and respected, had found love in places no one else ever knew about? We were different, no matter how much we tried to hold on to the simpler version of ourselves. For a few weeks, I tried to push it all aside, even though June's memory seemed to follow me. Every time I'd look at Eric, some part of me wondered if he had the same curiosity burning under his skin. But I didn't dare to ask. I wasn't ready to find out. Instead, I threw myself into work, into wedding planning, burying my doubts under a mountain of decisions about flowers and color schemes. I figured if we moved forward with the wedding, maybe everything else would fall back into place. But one Friday night, when Eric and I were finally sitting down after a long week, he brought it up. We were having wine and the house was quiet, just the two of us. His eyes had that same intensity they'd had during our weekend in the mountains, like he was seeing me for the first time, or maybe seeing something in himself he wasn't sure he wanted to admit. "Do you think June was happy?" he asked, his voice soft. I didn't know what to say at first. I thought of June's smile, the peacefulness in her gaze when she told me about Raymond. I think she felt alive. Maybe that's its own kind of happiness. Eric nodded, letting the silence settle. After a long pause, he finally looked at me, a vulnerability in his eyes that sent a thrill of fear and excitement through me. What if we gave ourselves the same freedom? My heart skipped a beat. You mean what? See other people. He hesitated, his expression shifting from fear to something I could only describe as hope. Not in the way you think. But what if we could be together without the weight of all these expectations? What if we didn't have to pretend that we're the only ones who will ever make each other happy? The words hung in the air, and I felt something inside me break open. A rush of feelings I hadn't let myself feel. I thought of June, her entire life colored by a love no one knew about, and suddenly it didn't seem so scandalous, it seemed brave. Over the next few weeks, Eric and I danced around this idea. Neither of us fully embracing it, but neither rejecting it either. We were cautious, testing the edges of this new understanding, like children dipping their toes into cold water. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Then one night we made a decision. We didn't know if it would be forever, or if it would change everything, but we agreed to try. To give each other the freedom June had spoken about. The chance to explore parts of ourselves that might never fit into the tidy box we had imagined for our relationship. We set boundaries, rules we thought would keep us safe, would keep us from falling too far. Honesty, we agreed. No secrets. It was a strange irony, to start this new chapter with rules about truth, when everything had been sparked by the discovery of June's secret. But we needed something to hold on to. The first time I met someone else, it felt surreal. His name was Tom, a friend of a friend, someone I never would have looked at twice before. But now, with this strange new permission, every interaction felt charged, electric. We met for coffee at first, our conversations innocent enough, though there was an undercurrent of something we both sensed. There was a thrill in the simple act of talking to him, a freedom I hadn't felt in years. When I came home, I told Eric about it, every detail. He listened, a look of fascination and trepidation on his face. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask for more, just listened. And to my surprise, instead of feeling guilty, I felt a strange rush of relief. The honesty between us was intoxicating in its own way. A new kind of intimacy I hadn't expected. Eric, too, began to explore, and though I tried not to think too much about it, he would tell me about his evenings with a woman he met at a networking event. Her name was Melissa, and she was older than him, with a confidence that he said reminded him of June. At first, hearing about her sent a spike of jealousy through me, but over time that feeling softened. Instead of resentment, I felt a strange gratitude, an understanding that love didn't have to be a cage, but could be something expansive, something that let us grow. Months passed and our lives transformed. I'd always imagined that relationships followed a certain script, one we had to adhere to if we wanted them to last. But now, Eric and I were living off script, and in doing so, we were discovering parts of ourselves we'd never known before. Some nights, I'd still feel a pang of fear, wondering if we were making a mistake, if this freedom we'd given ourselves would eventually tear us apart. But each time we'd come back to each other, sharing our experiences, our fears, our discoveries. It was like we were learning to love each other all over again, but without the pressure of having to be everything for one another. One day, as we were preparing for another family gathering, I stumbled upon an old photograph of June. She was young, maybe in her 20s, standing beside a tall, handsome man who was not Eric's grandfather. I recognized him immediately, Raymond, the man she had loved in secret all those years. I held the photograph, a feeling of profound gratitude welling up inside me. June had given us a gift, a legacy of love that went beyond convention, beyond the limitations we thought we had to accept. She had shown us that love could be both wild and tender, expansive and intimate, something that defied rules and lived on in the quiet moments we kept to ourselves. As Eric and I stood together, looking at that photograph, he took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "Are we crazy?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "Maybe," I said with a smile, feeling June's spirit somewhere nearby. "But maybe crazy is exactly what we need." Our love wasn't perfect and it never would be, but it was real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the weeks turned into months, Eric and I settled into our new rhythm, a strange harmony that felt more honest than anything we'd experienced before. We had days that were thrilling, filled with a sense of adventure, and days that were harder, moments of insecurity, moments when old fears would surface, and we'd have to remind ourselves why we had chosen this path in the first place. But each time we would talk it through, finding comfort in our openness, in the bond we were building on trust and mutual discovery. One evening we went to a small wine bar together, a place we'd both loved during our early days of dating but hadn't been to in years. It was tucked away on a quiet street, dimly lit and intimate, the kind of place where you could get lost in conversation and forget about the world outside. Sitting across from Eric, I felt the familiar warmth of being with him, the way he made me feel safe and understood, even as we explored this unknown terrain. We ordered a bottle of red and talked about everything, our conversation spilling from one topic to another. At some point I asked him, "Do you ever feel like this is changing us? Like maybe we're becoming different people?" He thought for a moment, swirling his wine. "I think it's making us more ourselves," he said softly. "Sometimes I wonder if we spent too long trying to fit into an idea of love, instead of letting it be what it is. I think we were always capable of this kind of connection. We just didn't know we could have it with each other." His words struck me deeply, and I felt a wave of emotion rise in me. Here was a man I thought I knew completely, and yet he was constantly surprising me, revealing layers I hadn't realized were there. I reached across the table, taking his hand. "You're right," I whispered. "I feel like I'm finally meeting the real you." After that night, something shifted between us. It was as though the openness we'd cultivated, the honesty and courage to face our own desires, had taken our relationship to a new depth. We felt closer than ever, yet free. Our connection had evolved beyond jealousy, beyond the boundaries we'd once assumed were necessary to keep love strong. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I still struggled with doubts, but those moments only made me appreciate our journey even more. One weekend, Eric surprised me with a trip to a secluded cabin in the woods. It was something we'd talked about doing for years, and I could hardly believe he'd finally made it happen. The cabin was beautiful, surrounded by tall pines and situated near a quiet lake, with a wraparound porch that overlooked the water. There was no cell service, no distractions, just us alone with our thoughts and each other. On the second night, as we sat by the fire, Eric turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we'd never learned about June's secret?" I thought about it, trying to imagine a life where we'd never heard her story, where we'd stayed within the boundaries we'd once believed were necessary. I think we would have ended up living a shadow of what we have now. We would have been happy probably, but maybe not alive. Eric nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. I agree. It's like she gave us permission to question everything we thought we knew about love. And maybe that's the best kind of legacy. To teach people that love isn't always simple or predictable, but it's worth exploring. We stayed up late that night, talking about the future, sharing our fears and dreams, everything laid bare in the quiet of the cabin. I felt a deep gratitude for June, for her bravery, for her willingness to live a life that defied expectations. She had shown us that love didn't have to fit into a box, that it could be as limitless as we allowed it to be. Over time, our lives continued to evolve. We met new people, both individually and together, and each experience enriched our relationship in ways we hadn't anticipated. There were new friendships, brief connections, and even at times moments of longing that brought us back to each other with a renewed appreciation. Through it all, Eric and I remained each other's constants, our love deepening with every twist and turn, every discovery and challenge. One evening, nearly a year after June's passing, we decided to visit her grave. It was a misty autumn day, the air thick with the scent of fallen leaves, and as we stood beside her gravestone, a sense of calm settled over us. Eric placed a small bouquet of lilies by her headstone, his fingers lingering on the stone. "We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for June, for Eric, for the journey that had brought us here. I realized that love, true love, wasn't about control or possession. It was about freedom, trust, and the courage to let each other grow, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. As we left the cemetery that day, a quiet understanding settled between Eric and me, as if we had reached a new chapter in our relationship. June's legacy had become part of our own story, a reminder that love could evolve, expand, and challenge everything we thought we knew. Yet there was still something unspoken between us, a faint question lingering in the back of my mind, and I wondered if Eric felt it too. Could this love, as boundless and accepting as it had become, still hold us together over time? Or would it eventually loosen its grip, letting us drift into different lives? In the following months, we began to find new ways of connecting, new routines and rituals to ground ourselves. We had a standing truth night every week, a ritual we'd started after that first weekend in the cabin. We'd sit down with no distractions, no phones, no work, just each other, and talk about everything that had happened over the week. Sometimes our conversations were light, filled with laughter and stories of the people we'd met, or the odd moments that had brought us joy. Other times they went deep, uncovering feelings we hadn't admitted even to ourselves. It was during one of those truth nights that Eric surprised me. We were sitting by the fireplace, the light casting a warm glow over his face, and he looked at me with a serious expression, as if he were about to say something he'd been holding back. "I've been thinking about June," he said quietly, "and about Raymond. I keep wondering what she saw in him that she couldn't find with Grandpa." I nodded, understanding. We'd often talked about June and Raymond, speculating about the kind of love they'd shared, and what it must have been like to carry that secret for so many years. "What do you think?" I asked, trying to read the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Eric looked down, running his hand along the arm of his chair. "I think maybe she loved Raymond because he reminded her of the parts of herself she couldn't be with anyone else. Maybe he was a mirror to those parts that were hidden from everyone else." He paused, his gaze meeting mine. "Do you ever wonder if there's someone like that for each of us? Someone who brings out a part of us we don't even know?" A shiver ran down my spine. The thought was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. I had always believed that Eric and I were each other's mirrors, that we saw each other as no one else could. But what if there was truth in what he was saying? What if our hearts had spaces only certain people could unlock? Eric must have seen the mixture of fear and excitement in my expression because he reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "I don't mean it in a way that would pull us apart," he said gently. "But maybe we shouldn't be afraid to keep searching for new parts of ourselves, for connections that might show us something we didn't even know we needed." Over time, those words became our quiet promise to keep growing both together and as individuals. It was as if we had granted each other permission to wander a little, to explore who we were beyond the roles we'd once assigned to ourselves. And slowly, that freedom led us to even more unexpected places. A few months later, during one of our truth nights, I told Eric about someone I'd met at a photography class I'd signed up for. His name was Daniel, a tall, reserved man with an intense gaze and a passion for art that rivaled my own. We'd connected over shared interests, staying late after class to discuss our favorite photographers, our favorite places in the city to capture moments no one else noticed. There was a spark there, a sense of discovery, and when I spoke of him, Eric listened intently, no trace of jealousy in his expression, only curiosity. "You should spend more time with him," Eric said after I finished, his voice gentle and encouraging. "I think he's bringing out something in you, something beautiful." I felt a warmth in my chest, both from his words and from the feeling of acceptance. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, truly supported, in a way that transcended traditional love. It was love without boundaries, a love that didn't demand exclusivity but thrived on freedom, trust, and the joy of seeing each other grow. In return, Eric told me about a colleague he'd been growing close to, a woman named Julia who shared his love for history and had an infectious enthusiasm for life. They'd been meeting up for lunches, losing track of time as they delved into conversations that made him feel inspired in ways he hadn't felt in years. As he spoke of her, I could see the happiness she brought him, a glow in his eyes that only deepened my love for him. And yet, through all of it, we kept coming back to each other, always honest, always open. Our love became a constant, a safe harbor in a world that was ever-changing. We learned to let go of the need to control each other's lives, instead choosing to celebrate each other's experiences, even when they didn't always include us. As time passed, I realized that the journey we had embarked on had given me a profound sense of peace. I no longer feared losing Eric, nor did I fear that our love would fade. Instead, I understood that love could be resilient, evolving to fit whatever shape we needed it to. We didn't have to follow a single path. We could create our own, one that was true to who we were and who we were becoming. And as for June, her memory remained a guiding light in our lives, a reminder that love was as vast and complex as the human heart. I often found myself thinking of her, wondering if she would have been proud of us, of the life we'd created out of her secret. I liked to believe she would have been. After all, she had lived a life of quiet rebellion, loving in a way that defied expectations and left a legacy we would carry forever. In the end, Eric and I found ourselves in a place we could never have imagined. We were both each other's anchor and our own wings, our love stronger than ever, not in spite of the choices we'd made, but because of them. We had found a way to honor June's memory not by living in her shadow, but by embracing the same courage she had shown, the courage to love fiercely, to live truthfully, and to let each other be free. In the months that followed, Eric and I continued to navigate this uncharted territory we'd created together. There were moments of doubt, of course, but with each step, I felt myself growing more confident in the path we had chosen. I came to see our relationship as something almost sacred, a space where we could be our truest selves, without the constraints that had once felt so suffocating. We were bound by choice, not by obligation, and that freedom brought a kind of closeness I hadn't known was possible. As our lives unfolded, our truth nights remained a constant, a grounding ritual that connected us to the foundation we had carefully built. Some nights, these sessions were light and playful, with us sharing the humorous mishaps of our week. Other nights, they were filled with deeper revelations, questions about who we were, and what we wanted our lives to look like. It was as though we were writing our own vows each week, redefining what it meant to be partners. One evening, after a particularly challenging day at work, I came home to find Eric already waiting for me with a glass of wine and a gentle smile. He knew I was exhausted, and without a word, he wrapped his arms around me, holding me close until the tension eased from my shoulders. Moments like these reminded me that, no matter where life took us, he was my home. Sipping our wine in the soft glow of the living room, I found myself confessing something I hadn't said out loud yet. "Eric," I began, "sometimes I still worry. I worry that this freedom we've given ourselves could somehow lead us away from each other." Eric's eyes softened as he listened, his hand resting on mine. "I know," he replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "But I think we've proven that our love isn't threatened by the freedom we've chosen. If anything, it's grown stronger because we're letting each other be exactly who we are." I nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. His confidence steadied me, reminding me of the strength we'd built over time. We were no longer afraid of exploring the boundaries of our relationship, but rather, we had embraced the unknown with open hearts. A few weeks later, we received an unexpected letter from June's lawyer. I hadn't even known she'd left anything behind for us, but the letter invited us to her home, where a box had been set aside specifically for Eric and me. Intrigued and a bit nervous, we made the drive up to her old house, a place filled with memories and echoes of her life. In her study, a small locked box awaited us. The lawyer handed Eric a brass key, and with a look of curiosity, he opened it. Inside, we found a collection of letters, dozens, maybe even hundreds, carefully folded and tied with faded ribbons. The handwriting was delicate, almost artful, and immediately, I knew these were the letters she'd exchanged with Raymond. We sat down on the floor, opening the letters one by one, reading about a love that had existed quietly, hidden from the world but alive in every word on those yellowed pages. She spoke of secret rendezvous, of laughter shared in quiet places, of the thrill of forbidden love that had somehow defied the limits of time. It was as though we were peering into a window of her soul, glimpsing the parts of her she had never shared with anyone but Raymond. In one of the final letters, dated just a few years before her passing, she wrote something that struck me deeply. "Perhaps love isn't meant to be kept or contained. Perhaps love is meant to be shared, to grow and evolve as we do. I have loved two men, both in different ways, both with all of my heart. And if that makes me selfish, then so be it. I have chosen love over fear time and time again, and that has been my freedom, my secret gift to myself." Her words resonated within me, echoing the journey Eric and I had taken. June hadn't left us with mere memories. She had left us with a lesson in courage, a reminder that love was as vast and boundless as we allowed it to be. She had lived a life of quiet rebellion, of secret passion, and in doing so, she had gifted us the freedom to forge our own path. As we drove home that evening, the weight of her words lingered between us. I could see that Eric was as moved as I was, his expression one of quiet reflection. "She knew exactly what she was doing," he said finally, a hint of admiration in his voice. "She wanted us to understand that love doesn't have to fit into a single mold. She wanted us to see that it's okay to embrace the complexity, to live fully." In the weeks that followed, Eric and I grew even closer, the memory of June's letters weaving into the fabric of our lives. It was as though her spirit was with us, guiding us, encouraging us to keep exploring, keep loving, keep growing. Our lives had become a blend of the conventional and the extraordinary, a relationship that was both grounded in trust and open to the infinite possibilities that love could offer. Through it all, Eric remained my partner, my confidant, the person I returned to at the end of every journey. And each time we shared our lives with others, we always returned to each other, stronger and more in love than before. There was no jealousy, no fear. Only a deep respect and an unbreakable bond that had been forged in the fire of truth and trust. Looking back, I realized that June's secret had been more than just a revelation. It had been a catalyst, a quiet nudge toward the life Eric and I were always meant to live. She had shown us that love was not a single path, but a landscape vast and varied, with room for every kind of connection, every kind of expression. Years later, as Eric and I stood together in our home, surrounded by friends, laughter, and love, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. June's story had become part of our own, her courage living on in the choices we made every day. She had taught us to live without fear, to embrace the fullness of life, to love without limits. And in the end, we discovered that true love was not about restriction or control, but about liberation, about setting each other free, and in doing so finding a love that was boundless, resilient, and beautifully, endlessly alive. As the years passed, our lives continued to unfold in ways I could never have anticipated. Eric and I had built something that defied easy definition, and yet, in the quiet moments of togetherness, I often marveled at how solid and comforting our love felt. We had constructed a life that was not confined by traditional boundaries, but held firm by a foundation of honesty, respect, and acceptance. Our relationship was an evolving story, and each chapter only strengthened the bond between us. We had even begun to share some of June's wisdom with a few close friends, letting them in on the path we'd chosen. Some were intrigued, others skeptical, but the most interesting reactions came from those who were curious, those who had also quietly wondered if love could be something more expansive. I realized that June's story, once so private, was now rippling outward, inspiring others just as it had inspired us. Her legacy was reaching beyond us, encouraging others to question, to reflect, and perhaps to take bold steps of their own. Then came a time that brought both of us an unexpected challenge, a test of everything we had built together. Eric was offered a job in a different city, one that would require him to travel frequently and live away from home for months at a time. It was a career opportunity he'd dreamed of, a chance to work with some of the brightest minds in his field, and I knew how much it meant to him. But it also meant a change in the closeness we had grown accustomed to, a distance that would challenge the rhythms of our lives. I encouraged him to take it, though the decision filled me with a mix of excitement and anxiety. The freedom we'd chosen for ourselves had always included being physically close, grounded in the same space where we could reconnect at the end of each day. Now we'd be putting that freedom to a different kind of test. But there was also a thrill in knowing that we were strong enough to face it. We both understood that love wasn't about clinging to one another, but rather allowing each other to grow, even if that growth took us in different directions. Eric moved in the spring, leaving our home feeling suddenly quieter, larger. At first, I filled my days with work and friends, embracing the independence I hadn't felt in years. Yet, as much as I missed him, there was a part of me that felt exhilarated, like I was rediscovering parts of myself I'd left behind. I spent my evenings reading, taking long walks, signing up for art classes, and finding joy in new experiences. I knew Eric was doing the same, finding his footing in his new city, making connections and immersing himself in his work. Our truth nights became phone calls, often late at night, where we'd share stories, thoughts, and the small discoveries that filled our days apart. The distance, rather than weakening our bond, seemed to sharpen it, infusing our conversations with a renewed sense of excitement. We were learning to appreciate each other from afar, to treasure the moments we could share when he came home. During one of these weekends, as we sat on our porch watching the sunset, Eric told me about a woman he'd met, a colleague named Lila, whose presence had brightened his days in unexpected ways. He described her warmth, her laughter, and the way she seemed to understand him without words. There was a gentle admiration in his voice, one that might have sparked jealousy in the past, but now only brought a smile to my lips. "You should spend time with her," I said, surprising even myself with the steadiness in my voice. "I trust you, and I trust us." Eric looked at me, gratitude and love shining in his eyes. "I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're my home. You're the person I'll always come back to." His words were more than a reassurance. They were a promise, a reminder of the depth we had reached together. That weekend, as we spent our days talking, laughing, and rediscovering each other, I felt a profound peace settle within me. I knew that no matter where life took us, no matter who we met or how far we wandered, we would always find our way back to each other. Over time, Eric's connection with Lila grew, just as I began to develop a close friendship with someone new, a man named Owen I met through a mutual love of literature and art. Owen was gentle, thoughtful, with an intense curiosity about life that drew me in. Our conversations ranged from books to philosophy, and in his company I felt a part of me reawaken, a side I hadn't explored in years. Yet, through it all, my love for Eric remained the same, a steady pulse that guided me home at the end of every day. In a way, we were both living two lives, a shared life of partnership, grounded in love and commitment, and separate lives that allowed us to grow in directions we hadn't anticipated. I began to realize that this was what June had discovered all those years ago, the beautiful paradox of loving deeply, while allowing each other the freedom to be fully ourselves. She had lived with her heart wide open, letting love be something fluid, something that could adapt and grow as she did. Years passed, and our lives continued to intertwine in unexpected ways. Eric and I would still return to June's letters every now and then, reading her words as if they were a guide to this journey we had chosen. Her spirit seemed to linger, a quiet reminder that love was not a finite resource, but an endless wellspring that we could draw from, again and again. One evening, as Eric and I sat together in our home, watching the glow of the city lights through the window, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We had weathered so many changes, so many seasons of growth and challenge, yet our love had endured. It had adapted, expanding to fit the contours of our lives, growing stronger with each test. Looking into his eyes, I knew that our love was something rare, something that went beyond the ordinary definitions of marriage or commitment. It was a love built on trust, on acceptance, and on the understanding that we didn't have to possess each other to belong to one another. As we sat in silence, words unneeded, I thought of June, of the courage she'd had to live her life fully, to embrace the complexity of love even when the world might not understand. Her secret had become our guide, her legacy a part of our own. And in that moment I knew that we were exactly where we were meant to be. A love story that was uniquely ours, a testament to the beauty of living without fear, of loving without limits. In the end, June's life had taught us that love wasn't about a single path or a single person. It was about finding freedom within connection, about allowing love to be as wild and expansive as the human heart. And as Eric and I continued our journey together, I knew that we would carry her spirit with us always. A quiet reminder that love could be both fierce and gentle, limitless and unbreakable, something we would continue to rediscover every day for the rest of our lives. As the seasons turned, Eric and I settled into a rhythm that felt like second nature. Our lives continued to expand in ways that would have been unimaginable years before, but somehow we had learned to let each new chapter flow seamlessly into the next. There was an understanding between us, a silent agreement that our love would always be a sanctuary, a place we could return to, no matter where life led us or who came into our lives. With Eric's job requiring long stretches in different cities, and my career in the art world growing, our time apart became both a challenge and a gift. Each reunion felt like a return to something sacred, a chance to rediscover each other with fresh eyes. But I found myself wondering, as time passed and the novelty of this arrangement began to wear off, if we would ever long for a more conventional life again. Would we ever crave the simpler life we'd imagined when we first got engaged, before June's story had sent us down this path? One autumn evening, Eric returned from a long trip overseas, his arrival coinciding with a milestone in my life, a gallery show that had taken months to prepare. He had rearranged his schedule just to be there, and seeing him walk into the gallery that night, looking slightly travel-worn but beaming with pride, filled me with warmth. We moved through the gallery hand in hand, surrounded by friends, patrons, and familiar faces, all of them unaware of the layers of love and complexity that held us together. At one point, a mutual friend, a woman named Rachel who had known Eric since childhood, pulled me aside. She'd had a few glasses of wine and seemed curious, her expression both playful and genuinely intrigued. "You and Eric have something special, don't you?" she said, glancing across the room where Eric was deep in conversation with a small group. "I've never seen two people so in sync, yet so independent. I don't know how you do it." Her words brought a smile to my lips, and for a moment I hesitated. How could I explain that the foundation of our love was a freedom few people would understand? That we had built our relationship on trust, exploration, and a willingness to let each other be fully, unapologetically ourselves? "It's different," I finally replied, choosing my words carefully. "We've learned to let each other grow without fear. I think that's what keeps us strong, knowing that we can change and still come back to each other." Rachel's eyes softened, and she gave a nod as if she understood. "That sounds beautiful. Scary maybe, but beautiful." Her words lingered in my mind long after the evening ended. As we lay in bed that night, Eric asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, feeling both a sense of contentment and a familiar twinge of uncertainty. Had we really found the secret to a lasting love, or were we just lucky? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on a journey with no clear destination, trusting only in the strength of our bond to guide us. A few months later, life threw us an unexpected twist that would test everything we had built together. I found out I was pregnant. The news hit me like a wave, both thrilling and terrifying. I had always thought we might have children one day, but we had never planned it seriously, assuming that we'd decide when the time was right. Now, standing in our bathroom with the positive test in my hand, I felt a strange mix of joy and fear. Would a child fit into the life we created? A life filled with independence, exploration, and unconventional choices? When I told Eric, his face softened with a mixture of surprise and tenderness. He held me close, whispering words of reassurance, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a new depth of emotion in his eyes, a vulnerability, an awe at the thought of becoming parents. It was as if we were being offered a new kind of adventure, one that would challenge us in ways we hadn't yet imagined. As the pregnancy progressed, our lives began to shift subtly. Our once spontaneous lifestyle gave way to a more settled routine, and I found myself wondering what kind of parents we would be. Could we raise a child with the same values that had guided our relationship? Honesty, freedom, and the courage to live authentically? Could we give our child the space to explore life's complexities without imposing the weight of our own expectations? In the months that followed, we prepared for this new chapter together, finding comfort in the stability we had never quite expected to build. Eric cut back on his travel, and I took a step back from my art projects, focusing instead on creating a home that felt warm and welcoming for the life we were bringing into the world. There were quiet evenings spent decorating the nursery, mornings filled with laughter and quiet conversations about the future. For the first time, our love had taken on a new shape, one that was softer, more grounded, and deeply connected to the life growing within me. One day, close to my due date, Eric and I found ourselves talking about June. We were sitting in the nursery, looking around at the small details we'd chosen together, and Eric took my hand, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you think June ever regretted her choices?" he asked quietly. "All those years of loving two people, of living a life so divided?" I thought about her letters, the passion and the wisdom woven through every word. I thought about the courage it must have taken for her to live a life so full of contradiction, of love that defied the traditional paths she'd been expected to follow. "No," iraplia softly. "I don't think she regretted any of it. I think she understood that life is too complex for simple answers. She loved as fully as she could, and that's what mattered to her." Eric nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "I hope we can teach our child that," he said. "That love doesn't always fit neatly into boxes, that it can be messy and beautiful and true, even when it's complicated." When our daughter Lily was born, everything changed in an instant. Holding her for the first time, feeling the weight of her tiny body in my arms, I understood a love so profound it was almost overwhelming. And as Eric held her beside me, his eyes filled with tears, I felt the full circle of our journey, how we had been shaped by June's story, by our own choices, by a love that had grown stronger with each challenge and each act of courage. In the months that followed, our lives slowed down, but in a way that felt right. We spent our days marveling at Lily's every expression, every coo, every tiny milestone. Our world became smaller, yet infinitely richer, filled with a love that transcended everything we had ever known. As Lily grew, Eric and I continued to nurture the values that had defined our relationship. We taught her about love's many forms, about the importance of truth, and the beauty of living a life true to oneself. June's legacy became part of our family's story, her courage woven into the fabric of our lives, a quiet reminder that love could be both fierce and gentle, boundless and unbreakable. Years later, when Lily was old enough to ask questions, we told her about June, about the love that had shaped our lives, about the bravery it took to follow one's heart. We didn't hide the complexities, the challenges, or the beauty of it all. And as she listened, her eyes wide with wonder, I saw in her a spark of understanding, a glimmer of the courage that had been passed down, from June to us and now to her. In the end, our love story was not one of perfect simplicity, but of boundless possibility. We had chosen a path that defied convention, guided by the wisdom of a woman who had dared to love on her own terms. And as I looked at the family we had built together, I knew that we had honored June's legacy in the truest way possible, by living a life of courage, of truth, and of a love that was as wild, resilient, and endlessly beautiful as the human heart.